when the polite neighbor gets angry. No declaration of war was needed, nor were borders closed. Just a single tax strike from Washington was enough to jolt Canada, America's closest partner, like a silent earthquake. And in less than 6 months, a nation once dependent on southern pipelines suddenly pivoted toward the Pacific, betting its future on Asia and Europe. This was no longer a trade dispute. It was a bold energy secession that's redefining the entire geopolitical chessboard of North America. The price of a swinging tariff. No one expected a tax order to trigger the deepest rupture between the U.S. and Canada in nearly a century. Not because Canada was too sensitive, nor because Washington was too reckless, but because, for the first time, long-standing trust was placed on the scale alongside the slogan, "America First." And when that scale tilted completely toward unilateral interests, Ottawa's response was no longer a protest, but a farewell. February 1st, 2025, a date that North American trade history will remember for a long time. President Donald Trump, after securing his second term, wasted no time reaffirming his hardline identity. With his powerful pen and familiar slogan, he imposed a 25% tariff on most imports from Canada, while slapping a 10% levy on all energy products. A blow aimed directly at the heart of Canada's economy: oil. What seemed like a bargaining tactic in stalled trade talks turned out to be something very different. Those words on white paper triggered a domino effect. From the farms of Saskatchewan to the refineries of Ohio, from emergency meetings in Ottawa to oil flows quietly rerouted toward the Pacific overnight. It was no longer a matter of policy, it was a test of trust. Americans, long accustomed to seeing Canada as a kind and predictable friend, may have forgotten one thing. Canada can be silent for a long time, but that doesn't mean it's powerless. Ottawa's anger didn't explode in words, but in action, suspending bilateral trade negotiations, calling urgent meetings with provincial leaders, and beginning to recalculate an export model that had been tied to the U.S. for over half a century. Ironically, just as Canada began unraveling the pipeline of trust with Washington, the U.S. acted surprised. But Trump had made everything clear before. If Canada wants to become the 51st state, the door is always open. A joke? Perhaps. But to Canadians, it wasn't an invitation. It was an insult. To absorb an independent country with its own history, culture, and pride into an imperial dream is a boundary even the most peaceful neighbor cannot accept. The 10% oil tariff was especially ruthless when Canadians realized they had been playing a game where the rules were written from the other side of the border. In 2023, Canada exported nearly $100 billion worth of energy to the U.S., about 25% of total bilateral trade. But when the so-called close bilateral relationship became an equation that benefited only one side, Canada understood that economic dependence was no longer an advantage, but a critical vulnerability. The consequences came quickly. Within just 3 months of the tariff blow, Canada's trade deficit with the rest of the world soared to a record 7.1 billion Canadian dollars. Revenue from the U.S., which had accounted for more than half of total exports, dropped sharply. But more alarming was the shift in market sentiment. Energy companies panicked, investors fled, and the federal government was forced to choose: either bow and renegotiate from a position of weakness, or boldly step into a new era, where oil no longer flowed south but sought its way east. Trump may have won a short-term hand, but he also created the first crack in what was once the most solid trade bridge in the Western world. And now that bridge is shaking. Not because Canada walked away, but because trust in the friendly neighbor was sold off for 10% per barrel of oil. In the end, the price of a swinging tariff isn't measured only in dollars, but in eroded trust, reversed strategy, and a new reality, where Canada is no longer a partner, but a counterweight. A silent pivot. There are moments in history when a nation doesn't need speeches, protests, or handshakes to make a decisive turn. For Canada, that moment happened quietly, in closed-door meetings in Ottawa, sudden ministerial trips to Tokyo, Seoul, and Brussels, and newly signed agreements sealed in silence. A vital pivot had begun, not with the sound of war drums, but with oil drops quietly changing direction. Before 2025, Canada's energy trade map was so simple it was almost crude. Crude oil from Alberta flowed straight to refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast of the United States, then got refined and sold globally, sometimes at added value that Canada never got to touch. But after Washington's tariff shock, what was once seen as a safe route became a dead end. And from a nation viewed as dependent on southern pipelines, Canada suddenly transformed into a pathmaker toward the West. Without declaring a U.S. exit, Ottawa only had to do one thing: stop sending what the U.S. always assumed was guaranteed. That was when suit-wearing officials in Calgary and Vancouver started asking questions they had never dared to ask. Why aren't we looking to Asia? Asia, long considered just an idea in strategic reports, suddenly became a real destination. China, India, Japan, South Korea, economies hungry for cleaner, cheaper, and more stable energy, became potential partners. But to make that idea a reality, Canada needed something it had never had enough of: infrastructure. That's when the name TMX, Trans Mountain Expansion, stepped into the spotlight. This so-called reluctant miracle pipeline project had started in 2019, but only came into full operation in May 2024. As all eyes turned to the unraveling U.S.-Canada relationship, TMX quietly increased its capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels of oil per day, and, most importantly, opened a path for Canadian oil to reach the Pacific Ocean. The pivot was not just geographic, but psychological. A country once programmed to view the U.S. as its only energy outlet now had to relearn how to engage with the world. Long-term contracts with ports in British Columbia, new deals with China, India, and South Korea were signed swiftly. Not because Ottawa wanted to move fast, but because it had no choice. When Washington shut one door, Canada had no time to wait. Instead of complaining, Canadians did what they do best: find sustainable solutions. They didn't break ties with the U.S. loudly, but neither did they allow themselves to remain tethered to an economy that shifted with the political winds of the White House. They invested in port infrastructure, oil tanker systems, and emissions reduction technology to meet Europe's high standards. Most of all, they crafted a new image: a Canada that is proactive, deliberate, and unafraid to trade comfort for independence. From March to May 2025, the numbers began to speak for every strategy. For the first time in history, China surpassed the U.S. to become the largest customer of the TMX line, importing an average of over 200,000 barrels per day, nearly 30 times more than a decade ago. At the same time, exports to South Korea, Japan, and India surged, shifting Asia's role from appendix to priority. Of course, the price of this turning point wasn't cheap. Longer transport routes, higher logistics costs, fiercer competition with the Middle East and Russia. But in the eyes of Canadian leadership, that's the price to pay for never again being caught off guard. They understood that no nation is strong if it relies on only one gateway. And when that gateway suddenly shuts, only those who had quietly prepared another path won't panic. Maybe Americans thought that tariffs would force Canada to yield. But in truth, they awakened a Canada even Canadians hadn't expected: decisive, redirected, and not looking back. That pivot wasn't loud, had no slogans, but each barrel of oil leaving Vancouver's port and each contract signed with Seoul was a message to Washington. Canada no longer stands behind. Canada is forging its own way. The neighbor's big bite. As Canada quietly pulled back, the Americans were busy doing the math, and they're very good at it. So good, in fact, that even as diplomatic relations cooled and oil flows began shifting, U.S. refineries, especially in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, were still smiling. Not because they didn't notice the growing rift, but because they knew exactly how to exploit it. In the world of oil, a few cents in price difference can decide who wins and loses. But in the post-tariff era, that gap wasn't in cents. It was in dollars. Many dollars. When the 10% tariff on Canadian energy officially took effect in February 2025, the selling price of Western Canadian Select, WCS, Canada's main crude oil, dropped to historically low levels. Meanwhile, West Texas Intermediate, WTI, the U.S. benchmark crude, remained firm. The price difference between WCS and WTI reached $8 to $10 per barrel. For every 100,000 barrels purchased from Canada, American refineries pocketed nearly $1 million in profit simply due to a nationality gap, an economic trap that Canada unwittingly fell into, where the U.S. was both the one imposing tariffs and the one buying at a bargain. And the story turns even more bitter when we look at the volume. In March 2025, right at the heart of the crisis, Canada still exported 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the U.S. This wasn't a relationship being cut off. This was a giant pipeline still pumping cheap resources, and the receiver was feasting like never before. This leads to a harsh reality. While Canada scrambled to transform, invested heavily in new infrastructure, and signed long-distance export deals, the Americans somehow still maintained a cheap, steady, and nearby supply, a trap of dependency that couldn't be dismantled overnight. It didn't stop there. U.S. refineries also used this cheap oil to produce refined products like gasoline, diesel, and chemicals, which they then sold globally at standard international prices, $5 to $7 per barrel, higher than their Canadian input costs. According to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA, in May 2025, the U.S. exported 7.2 million barrels of refined products per day, most of which were made from Canadian crude. In the energy globalization game, the winner is whoever controls the refining and distribution phases. And the U.S. took full advantage of that position. Instead of just being a buyer, they became the world's central refinery, with underpriced input and globally priced output. Profits doubled, even tripled. Meanwhile, across the border, Alberta was in crisis, with WCS prices falling to around $52 per barrel, sometimes lower. Many oil companies were barely breaking even, or even losing $5 to $20 per barrel compared to production costs. The shock wasn't just financial, it was emotional. A region once seen as an investment magnet for energy now had to plead with the federal government for relief. From there, a paradox emerged. Canada was punished for its own resources, and the United States, using a tariff system it created, ended up as the biggest beneficiary. If this was a victory, it might have been too perfect. The U.S. maintained supply, slowed Canada's pivot, and reaped enormous profits from a distorted price structure. Of course, this couldn't last forever. With swift moves from Ottawa and western provinces, the energy flow would gradually pull away from the U.S. But until that happened, every drop of oil kept flowing, kept generating profit, for the one who swung the tariff hammer first. In this carefully calculated energy game, perhaps the most bitter truth for Canadians wasn't that they were taxed, but that they were exploited twice, once by the global market and once by the very neighbor who used to call them a good friend. When new roads are opened. There's a truth Canadians understood very clearly after February 2025. If you don't build your own road, you'll forever have someone else taxing your path. And when Washington wielded a tariff decree like a blade slicing through traditional export routes, Canada didn't respond with words, but with concrete, steel, and the determination to fill the strategic gaps it had left open for too long. The key lies in three words: energy infrastructure. For over a decade, every major project aimed at moving oil and gas from Alberta's interior to the Pacific or Atlantic coasts had one by one failed. Energy East, the massive pipeline project meant to bring oil to New Brunswick, was cancelled in 2017 after fierce opposition from Quebec. Northern Gateway, the shortest route to get oil from Alberta to British Columbia's coast, was buried in 2016 under pressure from Indigenous communities and environmental activists. Those failures weren't just bad news for oil companies. They were proof that the country had never truly been ready to leave the commercial embrace of the United States. But the tariff war of 2025 changed everything. Canada's government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, no longer had time to hesitate. They understood that continued reliance on pipelines heading south meant economic suicide in a changing world order. And so, projects once deemed politically impossible were suddenly reborn with unprecedented speed. The first star on the strategic map was TMX, Trans Mountain Expansion. Once delayed by lawsuits, protests, and ballooning costs, TMX was finally completed and brought online in May 2024. And within just a year, the project proved to be more than just a pipeline. It was a game changer. With a capacity of up to 890,000 barrels per day, TMX became a new energy lifeline, delivering Canadian oil directly to Asian markets without passing through the U.S. British Columbia, quickly followed up by signing a series of long-term extraction and transportation agreements with China, South Korea, India, and Japan, turning Vancouver and Kitimat into new oil transfer stations for the Pacific. This transformation wasn't just about physical flow, it was a shift in geopolitical current. To serve this flow, a wave of investment poured into port infrastructure, storage facilities, and specialized oil tankers. The federal government committed to guaranteeing billions of Canadian dollars for pipeline and port projects, while also slashing approval procedures to accelerate construction. Speed was survival, and Ottawa knew it. A particularly noteworthy project was Eagle Pipeline, an ambitious proposal from Alberta to build an entirely new pipeline leading north to British Columbia, aimed straight at Asian markets without relying on federal infrastructure. The route is estimated to carry over 1 million barrels per day and would integrate advanced carbon capture technology to gain support from environmental groups and Indigenous communities. This isn't just infrastructure. This is strategy. In the eyes of Alberta and the Western provinces, the 2025 crisis wasn't just a punch from America, but also a wake-up slap from Ottawa. For the first time, these provinces stood strongly united in accelerating privatization, public-private partnerships, and charting their own export paths, without depending too heavily on the federal government. Meanwhile, LNG Canada, the largest liquefied natural gas project in Canadian history, based in Kitimat, entered its final phase and prepared for operation by mid-2025. This was a critical step in transforming Canada from a raw resource supplier into a complete energy provider, delivering LNG at international standards to Asia's clean, energy-hungry markets. In just 1 year, Canada's energy export map changed dramatically. What once seemed impossible, like breaking America's dominance, was now visibly taking shape. From a nation dependent on a single gateway, Canada was steadily building its own global exit. Broader, more stable, and less subject to outside control. This isn't just a story about oil or gas. This is a story about economic sovereignty. And for the first time in decades, Canada is truly taking the wheel into its own hands. The sprint in a political storm. As each barrel of oil began flowing westward, each LNG contract was signed with Asia, and each ship docked at Kitimat under cold floodlights. Another movement was unfolding at the heart of Canadian political power. Ottawa, a race against time, legality, and political legacy to steer a national system long known for its sluggishness. On June 2, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney convened an emergency meeting in Saskatoon, gathering all premiers from Canada's 13 provinces and territories. There were no formal ceremonies, no celebratory toasts. Instead, there were budget spreadsheets hollowed out by U.S. tariffs, tangled charts of unsold oil production, and the serious gazes of a government realizing, if they didn't dismantle the outdated bureaucratic machine, the entire country would collapse before it could restructure. At that meeting, an important declaration was made. Canada would end the era of 10 years of waiting just to dig a hole. A new mechanism was announced, called the National Interest Certification, allowing strategic energy projects such as pipelines, extraction sites, refineries, or export terminals to be approved within a maximum of 2 years, instead of dragging on for decades. This change wasn't just administrative reform, it was a survival-triggered leap. For years, Canada had been bound by a complex consensus model. Federal, provincial, Indigenous communities, environmental organizations. While well-intentioned, that system caused almost every major project to be buried under paperwork, lawsuits, and lobbying costs. But when Washington's 25% goods tariff and 10% energy levy cut through the export stream like a scythe, every party in the system had to agree. There was no more time for arguments. Alberta wanted to get oil to the sea. Quebec wanted to invest in green refining. Ontario wanted to develop hydrogen batteries. And British Columbia wanted to secure its position as the Pacific gateway of the entire economy. That rare consensus led to Bill C-5, a landmark piece of legislation urgently drafted by Ottawa in less than a month. Beyond shortening approval timelines, C-5 came with a $5 billion Canadian fund to support energy companies during the application and pre-permit infrastructure phases. Mark Carney called it an adrenaline shot for an economy being suffocated. But, in reality, it was also a declaration that Canada would not allow competitors to define its future through bureaucratic delays. In the new cabinet, a strategic energy task force was formed, empowered to directly intervene in priority projects and untangle regulatory knots from the outset. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Some environmental groups immediately warned that cutting approval times would lead to looser emissions oversight. Indigenous communities feared that speed would override consultation rights. But instead of dodging the criticism, Ottawa issued a firm commitment. All projects with national interest certification would still undergo independent environmental assessments and engage in Indigenous consultations according to international standards, only now organized more efficiently and transparently. More importantly, the spirit of Bill C-5 wasn't about bypassing procedure, but about urgently redefining what national interest means. In an age where energy supply is as strategic as national defense, Canada couldn't keep operating at peacetime review speeds in a wartime market. They needed a policy engine fast enough to match global market demands. And Bill C-5 was the first gear in that machine. After the Saskatoon summit, a slew of projects was added to the priority list, from LNG storage facilities in British Columbia to pipeline routes connecting Alberta with the Ontario Lake region to hybrid hydrogen wind power plants in Manitoba. Projects once dismissed for incomplete paperwork were now back on the table. Canada, once cornered into defense, was shifting to offense. And at the center of this full-speed sprint wasn't the feeling of betrayal by the southern neighbor, but the resolve to save itself. Not through slogans, not through blame, but through concrete, accelerated, and decisive action. A country once known for moving slowly is now accelerating because there is no other road left. And perhaps that is what Washington miscalculated most: the line between speed and justice. Every sweeping reform carries consequences. When Canada decided to fast-track its way out of America's trade shadow, it didn't just cut through bureaucratic red tape. It also shook long-held principles tied to the nation's identity: consensus, listening, and responsibility to nature and indigenous communities. And when Bill C-5 was passed at lightning speed, the aftershocks from blurred lines began to spread. On June 6, 2025, just 4 days after the Saskatoon Summit, the Assembly of First Nations, AFN, the organization representing over 600 Indigenous communities across Canada, officially spoke out. They did not oppose economic development, nor did they deny the importance of energy infrastructure. But they asked, where are we in this rush forward? Our land, our water, our spirit, are they still part of the national decision-making map? From the perspective of Indigenous communities, Bill C-5 is a double-edged sword. It shortens the wait, but also shortens the space for dialogue. In the past, many energy projects were rejected, not because they were wrong, but because there wasn't enough time to explain, discuss, and negotiate with traditional landholders. Now, with a 24-month time frame, many fear they won't have time to prepare their voices before the bulldozers arrive. It wasn't just Indigenous voices. Environmental organizations quickly raised concerns as well. Climate Action Network Canada, in an urgent report, called Bill C-5 an erosion of democracy disguised as growth. They pointed out that if Canada allows projects to be labeled national interest without a clear obligation to demonstrate climate impact, then the green economy promised by Ottawa may be nothing but an illusion. Experts also highlighted a paradox. The government is pouring all its efforts into energy infrastructure, including oil and gas, while the international community expects Canada to be a symbol of green transition. Accelerating oil and LNG projects could backfire, undermining efforts to build a climate-friendly national image and potentially harming strategic trade negotiations with the EU or high ESG partners like the Nordics, Australia, and Japan. But Ottawa didn't remain idle in the face of opposition. Energy and resources. Minister Jonathan Singh held a private meeting with AFN leaders, pledging that the consultation process would still be fully implemented, just organized and scheduled differently. The government also set aside $600 million Canadian dollars from the C-5 Support Fund to finance Indigenous advisory panels, ensuring they have the legal, technical, and expert resources needed to negotiate on equal footing. At the same time, a new environmental assessment standard, called the Green Impact Threshold, is being urgently developed, requiring all projects labeled national interest to demonstrate emissions reduction strategies, use renewable energy in operations, and minimize harm to natural resources. The government hopes this tool will act as a balancing valve, while the wheels of investment spin faster. Still, one cannot deny, a crack in trust has formed. Many activists point out that even with added standards, the essence of C-5 is still a shift in priority from full process to timely results. And once speed becomes the top priority, the risk of blurring the line between development and imposition becomes hard to avoid. The question now is no longer, should Canada accelerate? But, can Canada accelerate without losing itself? Can this country, with its tradition of balancing economic growth and social responsibility, hold on to its identity at a moment when it's forced to choose between survival and standing still? From the halls of Parliament to the sacred fire circles on the edge of British Columbia's forests, that question is being asked. And the answer won't lie in legislation, but in how the government and the people engage in dialogue, compromise, and even accept slowing down when necessary. Because if Canada wants to become an energy superpower, it must remember that true power doesn't just come from what you build, but from how you respect what helped you stand in the first place. Born from pressure. No one becomes a superpower by chance. One only becomes a superpower when pushed to a point of no return. And Canada, a country once known for its calm, order, and moderation, crossed a new threshold in 2025. The line between being a quiet energy exporter and becoming an intentional energy power. Pressure from Washington didn't just create a crisis. It awakened a Canada that had never revealed itself before. More resilient, more ambitious, and, most importantly, no longer assuming the role of second fiddle in the North American game. Step by step, Ottawa began peeling away its protective layers, no longer hiding its desire for strategic independence, no longer shying away from leadership in the global energy supply chain. And as the Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX, reached full capacity, as the first LNG shipment from Kitimat sailed toward Japan, as Canadian expert delegations landed in Seoul, New Delhi, and Berlin, the world began to realize Canada was no longer America's backup plan. However, this transformation wasn't just about oil, gas, or pipelines. It was a comprehensive geopolitical repositioning, where Canada stepped out of America's economic shadow to build a new identity, a green, reliable, and multilateral energy superpower. The proof didn't lie in political speeches, but in the numbers. In the second quarter of 2025, oil exports to Asia rose by 62% compared to the same period the year before. LNG from British Columbia began taking significant market share in territories traditionally dominated by Russia and Australia. Long-term contracts with India, South Korea, and Singapore were signed. No longer seasonal purchases, but strategic 10-year partnerships. International analysis firms, from Bloomberg to Wood Mackenzie, began asking, could Canada replace Russia as Asia's LNG supplier? A question that just a year earlier might have sounded absurd. Now, no one dares dismiss the possibility. However, what's even more remarkable isn't that Canada might capture market share, but that it's redefining what it means to be a modern energy supplier. Unlike the Middle East, where politics and production are often rocked by instability. Unlike Russia, where energy is a geopolitical weapon. And unlike the U.S., where each election cycle can flip foreign policy. Canada is shaping an image as a non-shocking supplier, stable, transparent, environmentally friendly, and responsible to its partners. The Carney administration made no effort to hide this vision. In a speech in Vancouver, the Prime Minister affirmed, "Canada does not aim to dominate global energy, but we do aim to be a reliable milestone on the world's energy map." With that vision, Canada's new energy projects focus not only on volume, but on green technology, from low-emission gas refineries to integrated carbon capture pipelines to hydrogen storage facilities in Alberta. Everything is being shaped as a model of clean exports the world is eager for. Still, this success cannot be separated from its painful beginnings, from Alberta oil companies forced to sell at a loss, from Indigenous communities who felt ignored, to Canadian citizens shocked by energy bills that spiked at the start of the year. But perhaps every rise comes with a price, and Canada is proving it doesn't just endure hardship. It transforms adversity into momentum. The road ahead remains long. There are still objections, internal debates, cultural clashes, especially in the ongoing balance between rapid development and social fairness. But one thing is undeniable. Canada has stepped out from America's arms with its head held high. Now, with every barrel of oil no longer passing through U.S. refineries, but heading straight to the world, every contract signed no longer tied to Washington's favor, but to Ottawa's own strength, one thing is becoming clear. The new energy superpower of the 21st century carries not just resources, but also resolve. And Canada, at last, has learned how to rewrite the rules, not with brute force, but with resilience born from pressure.